Please take your seats. The event is about to begin. We have no planned fire alarm tests today. If the alarm sounds, please make your way to the nearest exit. Members of the Bloomberg security team will be on hand to guide you. Please take a moment to locate your nearest exit. As a courtesy to our speakers, we kindly ask that you switch your phones to silent. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Bloomberg's European headquarters. I'm Konstantin Kotsias. I chair our London office. Great to see so many of you here today, as we have the privilege of hosting Andy Haldane, Chief Economist of the Bank of England, for a lecture, as you can see, entitled Wealth, Health and Happiness of Nations, as part of the Centre for Policy Studies Going for Growth lecture series. This lecture clearly comes at an interesting time for both the UK and global economies, a range of challenges on the horizon, the UK's relationship with Europe as we leave the EU, rapid technological change and innovation, sustainability and climate change on the economic and policy agenda also. I just want to take a couple of minutes just to thank Andy. We've known him for a very long time. For all of the great work he's done over at the bank. Thanks for all that you do. You've been an absolutely terrific resource, first-class work, not just on the economic agenda, but on a range of other policy areas, research, data, a really excellent sort of thinker over at the bank. We're lucky to have you there. And there's a lot of noise around the future growth and prosperity for the city and the prospects for UK as an economic hub. We think, as you can tell, we're long the UK here at Bloomberg. We've got a big investment here that we're all sitting in. But we think the underlying strengths are clear and that London can no doubt continue to lead as a global financial centre, particularly if we grasp some of the opportunities around the future policy agenda around regulation. So we're confident, optimistic that we can live up to the task and look forward to that. After his keynote, Andy will have a fireside chat with Guy Johnson, co-anchor of Bloomberg Markets European Open show on Bloomberg Television. I encourage you all to watch it. It's probably the best show on Bloomberg TV. There you go, Guy. Little shameless plug, but it's actually really good. But before that, I'm delighted to introduce Tom Clougherty, Head of Tax at the Centre for Policy Studies, and our co-hosts for this evening. Thank you very much, Tom. Cheers.
Hi, well, good evening, everybody. Welcome again to Bloomberg. Thank you, Bloomberg, for hosting. What a fantastic venue. It really is like, for those of us from Westminster kind of visiting the future when you come in here. I'm Tom Clougherty, Head of Tax at the Centre for Policy Studies, but also the person who's kind of been behind putting this series of lectures together. I don't want to delay things for too long because you're not really here to listen to me, but just let me say a few words about why we're doing these lectures and why this is kind of an important series for the Centre for Policy Studies. The simple fact is that economic growth, in our view, is vitally important, that it's absolutely central to solving almost all of the problems we face, not just the economic problems, but social, political, health problems as well. We also tend to think that policymakers don't pay enough attention to economic growth. I think there's a general sense that economic growth is something that happens to policymakers, something exogenous, not something that they can promote or indeed destroy through policy choices. And even when governments do talk about growth, we don't think that they give it the priority that it deserves, given its central importance. And so the purpose of this series has really been to offer a partial corrective, to give a platform to thinkers with big original ideas about economic growth and how we can get more of it. What do people know about the Centre for Policy Studies? First and foremost, I think they know that we were co-founded by Margaret Thatcher in the mid-70s before she became leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. And that's obviously our heritage, but these lectures haven't really reflected a narrow ideology in any way. Certainly free markets are a central part of economic growth, and that's fed through all of these lectures. But we've really been looking for big ideas wherever they've come from. And so we heard first from Dambisa Moyo about the particular problems that liberal democracies face in trying to implement pro-growth policies. We heard from the successful entrepreneur John Mills about the need to promote high productivity sectors of the economy, especially manufacturing, and the role that the exchange rate pays in that. Most recently, we had Gerard Lyons, who was formerly a chief economic advisor to Boris Johnson when he was mayor of London. And he talked about his three-legged stool of pro-growth policy, the need for fiscal activism, monetary stability, and supply-side reform to all go together and pull in the same direction. So that brings us to tonight. And we're absolutely delighted, honoured to have Andy Haldane, chief economist at the Bank of England, with us this evening to talk about the wealth, health, and happiness of nations. It's a real pleasure because Andy is one of the most interesting economic thinkers in the country, possibly unique in the world of officialdom in being willing to think quite so radically and offer his thoughts with such candour. And so I think without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Andy Haldane.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that very kind introduction and for inviting me along. And thank you to Con for his very kind introduction and for having us here. These spectacular surroundings, very similar to the Bank of England, technologically. I thought, so here's the title. Quite a presumptuous title, I think you'll agree, to riff on what is probably the most famous book ever written on economics. Certainly a book that laid the intellectual foundations of the Enlightenment, laid the intellectual foundations of the Industrial Revolution, and in consequence generated what we've seen, an incredible mass flourishing of economies and societies over the last 250 years. I've repurposed the title in a way that I think would be sympathetic to Adam Smith, certainly would be sympathetic to his contemporaries and collaborators at the time, the likes of David Hume and Jeremy Bentham. And let me illustrate that with a couple of Smith quotes. So here's the first one. It's probably the most famous quote in The Wealth of Nations itself, probably the most famous book in economics. You read it for yourself, but it lays bare the benefits that might flow from enlightened self-interest in creating a collective benefit. Here's a second quote from The Wealth of Nations, far less famous. No society can surely flourish and be happy for which the greater part of the members are poor and miserable. A clear indication that issues of inequality, of cohesiveness, of cooperation were absolutely front and centre in Smith's work. Not just in Wealth of Nations, but in his earlier book, 59 book, Moral Sentiments, as well. It very much was a book of capitalism with a conscience, capitalism with a moral compass. Now, arguably, that compass is no longer pointing as due north as it might. And the quest is on for how capitalism might be rethought and perhaps reframed to change that compass bearing. And to that end, let me give you a second quote before I dive in. This one, a much more modern quote from the first female winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, in fact, in her Nobel lecture. And let me just highlight the second sentence, the final sentence here. A core goal of public policy should be to facilitate the development of institutions, keyword, that bring out the best in humans. And that will be the contention, the essence of my lecture this evening, that in repurposing capitalism, in generating the same mass flourishing that we've seen over the past 250 years, some recasting and reframing and refreshing of our institutions will be needed in the way that Elinor Ostrom sets out there so clearly. So here's the plan of action. I've got 30 minutes and about 60 slides. I've got no chance at all of getting through them. But let's see how we get on. I want to start with the past. It's a familiar history lesson, but it's nonetheless a compelling one, a remarkable one of that inflection point in human fortunes, that mass flourishing I mentioned earlier on. I want to give my own take on that, my own spin on that, which puts institutions, the 6 pillars of success, center stage in explaining that remarkable story of progress. But that progress has on some dimensions begun to slow down, perhaps even reverse. That model of capitalism has begun to fray, and therefore some refresh, reframing, repurposing of institutions, of those pillars will, I think, be needed. I've given it a name here, community capitalism. You can call it whatever you like, but it's about a reformulation and reframing of the model that served us spectacularly for the last 250 years. Here is just how spectacularly. This is plots of real income per head growth and real wealth per head. I've marked on here 1776, the date of the wealth of nations. Since that date, real incomes have risen 15-fold, and wealth has risen around 10-fold. Spectacular progress. That has meant that every generation has been roughly 50% better off than its predecessor. Absolutely remarkable. A new social norm, a generational norm, has been established of material progress generation by generation. That's the more remarkable for the fact that in the many millennia prior to that, both GDP growth per head and wealth had effectively stood still, century after century. There was no social norm, no generational norm of living standards progress prior to the dawning of the Industrial Revolution. You see that in different dimensions. Here we look at poverty, rates of poverty at the start of the 19th century were in excess of 90% of the global population. Today, at the start of the 21st century, that fraction has fallen to single-figure amounts. Of course, over the same period, the global population has risen. It's true that for much of the period since the Industrial Revolution, the absolute numbers of people in poverty, that's the pink blob here, has been rising. But with the dawn of this century, even the absolute numbers of people in poverty have begun to head south and currently stand well south of the 1 billion mark. That's lower than at any point in absolute terms since the dawning of the Industrial Revolution. If we turn from wealth to health, the remarkable picture is much the same. Rates of longevity have doubled since the dawning of the Industrial Revolution, having stood still prior to that, pretty much since the dawn of time. So our hunter-gatherers, 2 million years ago, lived 30-odd years. At the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, at the time the Wealth of Nations was being written, the expected lifespan was still 30-odd years. It's now well north of 80. Right-hand side panel, rates of infant mortality have fallen. There's a pink blob here, have fallen like a stone. Our economy has found a way decisively to break free of what was once called the Malthusian trap. We have no direct measures of something very close to Gus's heart, which is happiness, going way back. But we have some indirect proxies. Left-hand side is a measure of the social development index. That's risen tenfold over the last 250 years. Right-hand side picture, sort of indirect measure of happiness, how much leisure time we have, how much time is spent at work. Our working weeks have halved over the last 200 years, from north of 60 hours a week to just north of 30 hours a week. Just imagine how much extra utility, happiness you would get from being given an extra 30 hours of leisure each week. That's a scale that we are talking about. Last measure, just think of the average consumption basket of the average person over time. At the point Adam Smith was writing, that entire consumption basket was stuff to keep people alive. It was the everyday essentials of food and shelter. By the start of the 20th century, roughly a third of that consumption basket was given over to luxuries, nice to haves rather than have to haves. As of now, roughly 2/3 of our consumption basket is given over to what might be called luxuries rather than essentials. A huge, a momentous shift forward in living standards, economically and financially, across pretty much every dimension. It's not just economics and finance either. That inflection point in human fortunes has, of course, had an important shaping effect on our politics as well. This is a metric of the incidence of war that has been, as Stephen Pinkerton showed, secularly trending down over time, given impetus by higher incomes. And this picture looks at our political systems and the way they have converged over the last 150 years on an increasingly democratic model, aided and abetted, given a tailwind by the huge mass flourishing of our economies and indeed of our societies. That begs the question then, why? How is it so much of human history was spent flatlining, yet we saw this incredible inflection point 250 years ago? Well, a very simple, if you like, neoclassical explanation is a story rooted in the private sector and rooted in innovation. And truth be told, that has been a key part of the story. You know, back then, tail end of the 18th century, we had the amazing confluence of a bunch of innovations that propelled the first wave of the Industrial Revolution. I mentioned them here. Watt, of course, himself, a friend and contemporary of Smith. We had then a second Industrial Revolution during the course of the 19th century, the era of mass industrialization, electrification, and sanitation. We had a further third Industrial Revolution in the 20th century, the dawning of mass computing and digitization and the internet. And of course, there's much of talk right now about the fourth Industrial Revolution, all that will bring with it. That clearly is an important part, a key part of this inflection point narrative. But it doesn't fully fit the historical facts along at least two important dimensions. The first of which is that it's hardly as though the history of innovation began in the tail end of the 18th century. Innovation came thick and fast in every preceding century. Here are a few examples just to whet your appetite. There are many more that you could list. Why do these things not generate an inflection point in an earlier century? You know, why was not the printing press more important than the spinning jenny for generating societal improvement? The second fact, and this is drawn from work by Steve Broadbury and Wallace, comes from divvying up growth across time, in particular partitioning it into those periods when growth was rising, marked purple here, and those periods when growth was shrinking, marked here in pink. And if you divvy up growth historically, partition it in that way, it tells a very interesting story, which is that the reason why growth became positive at the point of the dawning of the Industrial Revolution was not about the growth periods being higher and greater. It's about the recession periods being avoided, becoming smaller. The purple is no bigger. If anything, it's smaller after 1776. What changes are the pinks. It's the ability to avoid recessions rather than go growth that explains the inflection point in our economies and in our societies. It was as much about the avoidance of the disruptive side effects of innovation as the innovation itself that explains why growth picked up from the 18th century onwards. In other words, the story of success, for me, isn't just rooted in the private sector. It is as much a story that's spread across private, public, and third sector civil society, acting in a complementary and mutually reinforcing fashion. Point one. And point two, the story of growth, the secret of growth. To understand it, you need two eyes, not one. The first eye of innovation, but as importantly, the second eye, which is institutions. It's the two acting in combination, in harmony, that held the key to the success story of growth over the last 250 years. And in particular, there are 6 institutions broadly defined, or pillars, that I think underpinned this success. They were the public limited company, limited liability banking, measurement systems for companies and for economies, public education, public infrastructure, and civil society, straddling all 3 sectors, acting in harmony. If you like, the public limited company provided the engine of industrialization. Limited liability banking provided the financial fuel for that engine. Measurement systems provided the instrumentation for that vehicle to understand what was working and what was not. Public education provided the driving instructors and generated our capacity to drive well and safely. Public infrastructure provided the roads to drive well and cheaply. And civil society provided the rules of the road to protect passengers and pedestrians. Each of those were essential elements in the growth engine firing. And let me say a word now about each of those 6 pillars of success, starting with the public limited company. Up until the middle of the 19th century, companies were not protected by limited liability. If you were a shareholder, all your worldly possessions were in principle on the line. You could lose your shirt, literally, and your house if the company went bust. That was a very powerful disincentive to put money into a company and therefore held back the growth of companies right up until the Limited Liability Act in 1855 that heralded a mass growth in shareholding that fueled and financed the growth of companies. Here I show the growth in their number, and on the left-hand side, the growth in their market capitalization. On the right-hand side, the PLC laid the foundations for mass industrialization and all the benefits to living standards and productivity that gave rise to. So too did the advent of limited liability banking. That came around 3 years after limited liability for normal companies. People were very cautious about unshackling banks. Nonetheless, the principle was the same, that by unshackling banks' balance sheets, they'd be more willing to finance and fuel those companies that were growing at a rate of knots, and therefore fuel in turn a growth in living standards. Here, this is the size of banks' balance sheets and their numbers of branches. Both experienced a very material pickup after the Industrial Revolution. Creditors in both companies and banks would have been much less willing to put their money in to a black box. And that's why, 3 years after banks had been given limited liability, the government required that companies file accounts to keep score on how those companies were doing. Company accounts were a natural progression in the growth of companies and banks. Here's a picture, took some constructing actually, of the number of auditors in the UK. Now, how remarkable that back in 1800, only 11 auditors in the UK. Can you imagine that time? And even by the tail end of the 19th century, fewer than 1,000 accountants. Nevertheless, this quickly became a rapidly growing industry, providing an assurance of company wealth and health that thereby supported investment in both companies and banks and fueled the Industrial Revolution. And what was true of company accounts was at the company level, individual level, was as true of national accounts at the economy-wide level. If you are to put money into a country, you need a means, an objective means of keeping score on how well that country is doing, and therein the seeds of our national accounts were sown in the US through Clark and Kuznets in the 30s, here in the UK through Keynes and through Mead and through Stone in the 1940s. And that very quickly became a global trend. This looks at the number of countries that over time have moved to a system of national accounts with GDP at its centerpiece. Now pretty much every country on the planet has GDP as a means of keeping score of how well economy-wide we are doing. Measurement systems, as arid as that may sound, were absolutely fundamental for explaining that inflection point in our economies and in our societies. And so too, of course, was human capital, was public education in its many and various shapes and forms. That roughly 18 years after companies were required to file their accounts, primary school education became compulsory in the UK and moved through the gears over time into secondary education as well, becoming compulsory. Latterly, we have seen, of course, the rise of tertiary education to the point that more than half of our workforce, young workforce, now ends up at university. The fifth pillar is the pillar of infrastructure. We know that public spending, government spending, has been on a secularly rising trend with a few wobbles in between since the dawning of the Industrial Revolution, spending on health and social security, and indeed public education. The bit I'd focus on here, and this again was a very tricky chart to construct, was about our transport infrastructure. In particular, roads left-hand side and rail on the right-hand side. Again, tail end of the 19th century, around the same time, 1963, through to about 1863, 1895, we saw the migration from private roads to public roads and from private rail to public rail, and the network expanded in the way that we see here. And finally, last but by no means least, the civil society strand of the six pillars, providing an underpin, an insurance device for society, not least in the teeth of the disruption caused by successive waves of industrial revolution. Again, a tough picture to construct over time, but during the course of the 19th century, we moved from quite informal charitable institutions, the churches, social movements, friendly societies, through to what we'd recognize today as charities. They've gone through the gears since then, doing a whole range of things. But in that initial early wave of charities, their role was often to protect those most adversely affected by the disruptive effects of innovation of various types. The six pillars. And a remarkable success story propped up by those six pillars, but it is a success story that, as of late, has begun to fray a bit at the edges. That upwards only ascent, that upwards-only escalator has begun to stall across a few dimensions. And equally, and accompanying that, we've seen something of a depletion or erosion of each of those 6 pillars that I have outlined. So let me say a word about that. But of course, it's that that's caused some questioning of our very model of capitalism, how it might need to be reformed or remodeled so that mass flourishing of the last 250 years can continue over the next 50. Well, here's one dimension of the slowing, and this looks just like at real pay for the median worker. We know in the US we have had now a lost half century of real pay rises for the median US worker. Here in the UK, the malaise, the disease has not been anything like as bad, but we have now lived through getting on for a lost decade of real pay for the median worker here. If we look at the sort of generational pattern, how real incomes evolve over people's life cycle for different cohorts, this looks at people born in the 50s, blue, in the 60s, sort of green, in the 70s, yellow, and in the 80s, blue. We had a clear pattern of upwards-only escalator for those born in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The signs of that escalator having stalled for those born in the 1980s. That generational contract, that social norm of each generation being perhaps 50% better off than its predecessor, is at risk of being breached. And that's even more clearly the case if we turn from real pay to measures of home ownership. Here you've again taken 4 cohorts. The First World War generation, the Second World War generation, the baby boomers in turquoise, and the millennials in purple. And clearly, for those millennials born towards the tail end of the previous century, rates of home ownership are tracking well below not only the levels of the baby boomers, but indeed below the levels of those born at the time of the Second World War. We are seeing, for the first time, I mentioned poverty had declined massively, but as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation pointed out just a few weeks ago, we now have a greater incidence of in-work poverty than in out-of-work poverty itself, the results of rather more insecure work today than has been the case probably at any time in the past. If we turn from wealth to health, that upwards-only path is at risk of flattening off. Life expectancy shows some signs of flattening off, and indeed in certain parts of the UK and in large parts of Rust Belt Middle America, we see now rates of life expectancy falling for the first time in at least 250 years. What's true of physical health is true to an even greater extent of mental health. This is one diagnostic on that, looking at just prescribed antidepressants, which have roughly doubled in many countries in their usage since the turn of the century. And as we're talking about health, individual health matters hugely, but so too, of course, does environmental health. And we all know the story here of the challenges faced by the climate crisis. Wealth, health, the final dimension was happiness. And here too, we see something of a plateauing, at least for economies, for countries who reach levels of annual GDP per capita, say north of $20,000 to $25,000 per year. Money can and does buy you happiness, but only up to a point. Finally, when it comes to the distribution of this wealth, a pattern much discussed over recent years is that despite falling levels of between country inequality that's come courtesy of globalization, we have at the same time in many countries seen rising levels of within country inequality. That's less obviously true in the UK along many dimensions, although one dimension along which it is true is if we look spatially, if we look regionally, because there regional differences and incomes, as the right-hand side picture shows, are at their highest levels currently for a century. Let me skip over that in the interest of time. Wealth, health, happiness, showing signs of fraying, and fraying too in each of those 6 pillars of success I mentioned earlier on. When it comes to the public limited company, the great benefits was the extra money limited liability would bring in. Yet in fact, these days, more money is extracted from the stock market than is brought in through the stock market. The numbers of listed companies has halved over the course of the past 2 or 3 decades. As John Kay and others have pointed out, it's no longer the case that stock markets, the PLC, is a net generator of financing of the wider economy. For our banking system, it's plainly got a bit bigger. In fact, it's got a lot bigger. But recent work has demonstrated that there might be limits to size. Indeed, there could be a point beyond which too much banking is not good for growth by acting as financial fuel, but in fact detracts from growth, perhaps by sucking resources into the financial sector and away from other sources. When we look at education, despite the mass expansion of primary, secondary, and tertiary education, this is yet to show up in many metrics of improved levels of social mobility. Indeed, in many of those metrics, we have seen regress rather than progress over the last several decades. When it comes to our infrastructure, in transport terms, this just looks at a couple of very simple proxies of road congestion and rail congestion, comparing meters of road to the numbers of cars and passenger journeys per mile of track. On those simple metrics, there's been a 5-fold increase in congestion of both over the last 70 years or so. And finally, on our social infrastructure, it is a very mixed and patchy picture. In many communities across the UK, we see the very fundamentals of that infrastructure: green spaces, high streets, museums, libraries, under threat, and the local community being ill-served by that crucially important social infrastructure. So if this model is no longer working quite as well as it has in the past, what then are the alternatives? Well, much debate right now on both left and right about what a better model might be. Is it one that involves more private sector and less state, or the flip side of that? And while we're arguing the toss about the relative balance of public and private sectors, what role for the third sector? What role for civil society? Raghu Rajan, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India's recent book, The Third Pillar, makes the point that actually the missing ingredient from our model of capitalism has been its neglect of what he calls the third pillar, what we might call the third sector, of community as distinct from private company or state. I'm going to suggest in my remaining time, which must be short, Guy, 2 minutes, 5 minutes? Thank you very much. I'm going to sketch, and no more than a sketch, given that I have only 4 minutes, 35 seconds, a rather non-radical alternative in the following sense. It will be founded on those self-same three sectors that underpinned the first industrial revolution. In other words, public, private, and third, acting in harmony, in a complementary fashion. But it will require something of a repurposing of each of those pillars. In fact, a repurposing that I think is very much in keeping with what Smith would have suggested, at least in his 59 book, Theory of Moral Sentiments. So let me sketch quickly, and then perhaps in the discussion we can elaborate a bit on how that refashioning of those 6 pillars might work, starting with the PLC. It's worked brilliantly for 150 years and counting. We've moved to a model where the shareholder is given, and certainly in this country, a position of real primacy. And the question is that as it should be? Given that companies are, in essence, social constructs, social animals rather than legal constructs, should there be a case for a more purposeful sense, a broader sense of what companies were put on earth to do, that move beyond the singular shareholder perspective to the plural stakeholder perspective that weigh, to a greater extent, the views of customers, of creditors, of clients, of workers, of communities, of broader society. And there's quite a movement, as many of you know, to rethink how we might make the PLC more purposive. Lots of things are possible. Within that, we should not rule out, perhaps even we should rule in, the possibility of making legislative change. Our current Companies Act 2006 reinforces the notion that shareholders should assume a position of primacy and that others are very much in the have regards. Perhaps it's time to give that model, that law, a rethink. Ditto when it comes to banking. Banking has been repurposing itself since the crisis. Has it gone far enough in doing that? There is at least a question mark, I think, there. And perhaps as part of that, we need to think how best we finance, in particular, our small and medium-sized businesses. The fault line in financing to SMEs has existed for at least a century. We are no closer today in closing that fault line than we were back in the 1930s. Rethinking about the role of regional banks, development banks, and infrastructure banks might be part of the solution to what at one time were called the Macmillan gaps. When it comes to our measurement systems, both for companies and for economies, the time is right for a refresh, is it not? For a rethink. For companies to move beyond P&L to a wider sense of ESG or integrated reporting that takes full and frank and fair account, not just of financial capital, but as importantly, social, intellectual, and environmental capital as well. And what is true of companies is true also of our economies in setting a course that looks beyond GDP to the multiple capitals that drive growth, that perhaps put well-being or happiness center stage in making judgments, not just for the economy as a whole, but on the particular dimensions of policy where it might be most important. For example, education and health policy, about which I know Gus has thought and written a lot. Our educational model, which has for a long time been the envy of the world, which has led the world for 150 years, I think is not fit for purpose for the next 50 years. A model predicated on teaching young people academic stuff will not serve as well in the decades ahead. Our educational model of the future will need to invest at least as much in educating and re-educating adults as it does young people, and it will, in tandem, need to spend as much time skilling and reskilling people in vocational and interpersonal skills as in academic skills. That will be quite a radical rethink of our educational model, one in which lifelong learning moves from rhetoric to reality. On public infrastructure, of course, it's improving the existing stuff, both physical and digital, but as importantly, it's rethinking and reframing what the new public infrastructure of tomorrow might be, which will almost certainly be digital rather than physical. We might discuss that a bit more afterwards. And finally, when it comes to the sixth pillar, the civil society pillar, in a world of more leisure time, one would hope that more of that would be put to work in voluntary pursuits in serving civil society. And if that were to be the case, a better way of recognizing and rewarding that civic contribution, I think, is overdue. Indeed, as part of that, perhaps even recasting what we mean by work. I finish with two quotes. One from Smith that makes clear just how high the societal stakes are if we fail to meet the challenges that I've set out today. And the other is just to repeat that quote from Elinor Ostrom of the importance as part of that of developing a new set of institutions that could generate just the sort of mass flourishing we've all benefited from hugely over the last 250 years. I almost managed all my slides in almost the time. Thank you all for listening.
Andy, thank you very much. We may run over a little bit. We'll see. The drinks will still be outside, though. I'm pretty certain about that. Andy, thank you. That was extremely interesting. I kind of jotted down a series of points as you were going along, but I suspect actually what we should do is probably focus more on the end about looking forward rather than necessarily looking backwards. But we'll start at the beginning. You talked about the advantage of not having deep recessions and the impact that that had had and how that was a catalyst for change. We, in all our recent memories, have just suffered a very deep recession that was caused in no small part by asset bubbles and the financial kind of effect that the City of London and Wall Street and et cetera, had on the global economy. If we carry on at the way that we are we going to end up in a situation where recessions increasingly become deeper? And what kind of damage will that do, and how do we deal with it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the good news, though, I mean, you're right that if we look at the course of history, it is the case that the deepest recessions and the longest recessions have tended to come at times of financial crisis, when financial balance sheets have got in the wrong place, have taken time to correct through deleveraging. Those are the forces, the potent forces, that elongate and deepen recessions, indeed depressions, if we go back to the 1930s. I mean, the good news here, and it's a lesson we should not have forgotten, of course, in the first place, is that we've hopefully learned that lesson, that when it is the case that balance sheets get badly misaligned from reality, financial balance sheets get badly misaligned from reality, that cliff edges follow soon after. And that's why, as you know, there's been a huge program of reform over the last 10 years, regulatory reform, to try and prevent a kind of recurrence of those imbalances arising in the banking system, indeed outside the banking system, for next time. So I'm hoping on that we have learnt a very important lesson. There's nothing automatic about bigger financial balance sheets making for bigger and deeper recessions, provided those balance sheets have safeguards in place. I think we're in a much better place now than 10 years ago on having those safeguards.
Do you worry about asset bubbles causing those?
Well, I mean, asset bubbles certainly can be an accompanying catalyst for recessions and depressions, as there have been in the past. Truth be told, as of today, I look round the world, I don't see balance sheets, by and large, being overstretched. I see still a very significant degree of caution among financial institutions, among companies, and among households when it comes to balance sheet stretch, leverage, and liquidity. And nor do I see big and rapidly growing asset price bubbles around the world either. Of course, there's always little bits of bubbly behavior in certain sectors, at certain segments, at certain times. But do I see the generalized risk-taking, rent-seeking, search for yield that is in any way comparable to what was the case, say, back in 05, 06, 07? I don't, actually. That gives me confidence that the balance sheet footings of the global economy, indeed of the UK economy, are in a fundamentally different place than they were back then, and therefore a repetition of the balance sheet recession of then is lower than financial markets might give it credit for.
Globalization clearly played a major role in what has taken place. As globalization goes into reverse, what is the effect of that on how our society is going to work together? You talked about the regional inequality that exists within the UK, and globalization may have been a factor behind that. As we go into kind of deglobalization, which I think, judging by the data, we probably are going into, what effect does that have going forward?
Well, first of all, on the how we got here, I'd say in aggregate, the evidence is overwhelming on the benefits that globalization has delivered to economies and societies. It's not a dimension I discussed this evening, but the evidence on that is overwhelming in terms of raising the aggregate wealth and well-being of societies. But the but is important, it's clear that those benefits were not shared equally across societies. Indeed, small cohorts of societies and economies were very hard hit by the displacement that came from globalization. And, mea culpa for me as an economist, or perhaps for us as policymakers, is to focus too little on the minority, but nonetheless the very hard-hit minority who were not the beneficiaries of globalization. And in some ways, the debate that's going on now is recognition of the importance of the losers as well as the winners from that globalization process. All boats were not lifted, or still not lifted equally. And that's why some refresh of where we are, I think, is overdue.
Does deglobalization reverse that?
Well, I don't know yet that we're quite into that downslope for globalization. I mean, you see it on trade to an extent. The trade, what has now become a trade war, really, albeit largely a bilateral trade war of the past couple of years. We've not seen wholesale retrenchment of flows of goods and services generally. I mean, global trade has been weak, but not negative. We haven't seen a rapid retreat of flows of monies across borders. And by and large, we haven't seen a rapid retreat of flows of ideas or information or people across borders. So I'm not yet at the point of calling peak globalization. In future, as much of the diffusion of the good things, like innovation and technology, will be through flows of information and ideas. And it's hard to put that genie back in the bottle, I think.
Yep. The Business Council over in the States, the Business Roundtable, has moved away from Friedman. Right? The profit motivation is no longer there. You talked about reconstructing and rethinking the public company. How does that actually work in practice? How do we make businesses better at serving not just the shareholders, but all of the stakeholders involved? How does that actually work in practice?
Well, I think we've got actually plenty of case studies from around the world of this working somewhat differently than it does in the UK and the US. You know, there's corporate governance models galore elsewhere around the world that strike a somewhat different balance between the needs of those different stakeholders that I listed earlier on. Germany, Japan would be two examples where there's more a kind of co-determination model of how a company works and for whom a company is operated and run. So some of that is rooted in law. A large part is rooted in custom and practice. I think we probably need bits of reform to both to generate the sort of reform I think we might need in terms of making companies more purposeful. Already we have movements in the US, for example, the emergence of so-called B corporations, benefit corporations in the US that have a more eclectic, more plural sense of their objectives. So this is certainly possible. We're not lacking models of how this might work, practical models.
Do any of them work well in your mind?
Well, I think there are plenty of examples around the world of models that have secured a greater degree of investment, a greater recycling of retained profits, high levels of investment in the skills and training of their staff, businesses that have put their best foot forward when it comes to tackling environmental challenges of various types. So yes, I think we are not short of case law from elsewhere around the world. In fact, we're not short of case law in this country of companies acting in a purposeful fashion. We just need to spread that a little bit more evenly than is the case right now.
What's a good job?
What is a good job? Well, it's one that I think that pays well, and let's not forget pay.
Okay.
It's one that offers security to the employee as well as pay. There's been a big focus over recent years on good work, and that focus is partly born out of the rise in the number of insecure jobs. In some ways, we've moved from the scourge of the 70s and 80s was joblessness, was job insecurity. Today's scourge is somewhat different. The scourge of the noughties is probably income insecurity as distinct from job insecurity. And therefore thinking of ways of offering secure employment, of engaged employment. We know that there are benefits of engaging your workforce and training your workforce, not just for the individual, but for the company and for the economy at large. So good work for me is all of those things. It's engaged, an engaged workforce. It's a secure workforce. It's a well-paid workforce, and ultimately a productive workforce. Because a productive workforce makes for productive companies, and productive companies make for productive economies. And there is no greater signature challenge for this economy than the productivity challenge.
How do we get there? How do we get companies to generate good jobs?
Well, I think good work, to coin an expression, was done by Matthew Taylor a couple of years ago on behalf of the May government. His report on good work and how best to deliver it. And the lion's share of the recommendations in Matthew's report are now in the process of being implemented. I do think we need some trailblazers, some exemplars of companies doing the right thing by their staff and being rewarded in higher productivity and higher profits. Because you mentioned earlier on, this is not forgoing profit. This is more a question of the time horizon over which profits accrete. And indeed, what is done with those profits when they do accrete. is it reinvested back into the business, or is it remitted back to shareholders? And
Is quarterly reporting a bad idea?
well, I think there is certainly evidence, not overwhelming evidence, but certainly evidence that a requirement to meet the needs of the analysts on a quarterly cycle might encourage companies to not just focus too much on the shorter term, but to pay out too much in profits in the short term and reinvest too little in both staff and in physical assets of various types, to the long-term detriment not just of the economy, but of the company and its shareholders. And I think it's certainly one of the many aspects that might be looked at as a way of removing the otherwise natural incentives to shareholder primacy and shareholder short-termism.
Do you think people, regional inequality, let's talk about that for a moment. Do you think there is enough done to help people move to areas where there are jobs, or do you think jobs should be moved to areas where there is inequality? You have a housing market that discourages people moving, but there is also some evidence that suggests that those areas there isn't enough of an incentive, or there is not enough of a desire to move to where jobs can be found. How do we fix that?
Well, I think the answer lies in both of your solutions. So, geographic mobility in the UK is falling, and has been falling for a few decades now. There's a bunch of reasons for that, but other things equal, you would want people to feel willing and able to move to help climb the jobs ladder and to have better work at a better wage. Equally, I don't think an answer to our regional inequalities is for everyone to move to London, the most productive and highest paid region in the UK. We absolutely need to build out and build up the prospects across all of our regions. This is the government's levelling up agenda, and I can think of few agendas that are more important
Is that transport?
That.
Is it? What is it that we need to do?
Well, we know a lot about the deep sources, the structural sources of regional problems in those areas that are being left behind. There's never one silver bullet solution. It's a complex cocktail. It's a complex needs case. Of course, it's skills on the ground. Of course, it's educational systems. Of course, it's transport infrastructure. Of course, it's digital infrastructure. Of course, it's local governance. Of course, it's social infrastructure, those green spaces and high streets I mentioned earlier on. It's all of the above, and it's very context specific. I mean, interestingly, I showed you a picture of widening regional divides. The divides within regions are larger and have been widening faster than the differences across regions. So tailoring those levelling up policies to local needs is absolutely crucial. And that's why the decentralisation, devolution agenda is so important, because that is the means by which we can tailor policies to local needs and, crucially, give local agents agency over their decision making. There's a reason why the UK stands out.
So do we need strong central government or strong regional government?
Well, we need much stronger regional governance and government than is the case right now. The history of UK regional policy has been of one, low levels of decentralisation and devolution relative to most other high-income large countries, and two, an almost constant sort of flux in the setting of regional policy, a chopping and changing over the course of at least 100 years. And those, in some ways, kind of bake in and preordain failure in regional policy, because there's never the roots established of the civic institutions, that word again, those anchor institutions, and the local capability and capacity that is the wellspring of success. A few years ago, the World Bank discovered that before we started, putting monies into countries, they need first to build capacity at a local level. Because without that, local policies would not stick and would not work.
Yep.
And the self-same thing is true of the UK regions. Right now, there are some fantastic examples of regions that are well run, that have the local capacity and local capability. But there are many more where that capacity and capability doesn't really exist and needs to exist to make a success of the levelling up agenda.
Gilt yields are at 0.5. Is now the time to spend money?
For a government?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, far be it from me, Guy, to be commenting on fiscal policy. That's one of the cast iron.
You have many hats.
Yeah, but one of them isn't fiscal. So I shall not be padding on that. But it's true enough that the cost of borrowing for government has never before, I think in human history, been lower than now.
Yep.
And that is a not unimportant reason why the government now feels it has more fiscal space today than it felt it had a few years ago. And of course, the relevant calculus here is to think about, how does that cost of capital, in other words, a real cost of borrowing of roughly zero for 50 years, compares with a social return on investment from spending that money. So that one key consideration is, is the social return on investing in the stuff I mentioned tonight, hospitals, schools,
Yep.
infrastructure, north of zero? Far be it from me to opine on that, but that strikes me as the relevant calculus when it comes to your question.
Okay, who's got a question? If you could say where you are from, that would be extremely useful.
Long-term real yields have been negative. They're quite deeply negative in the UK, but they've been negative across many countries globally. And it just seems very unusual for that to be persistent, as it has been over the last few years. What, in your opinion, seems to be holding people back from making those investments? What is the thing that needs unblocking?
Yeah. Well, in a sort of arithmetic, in a behavioural sense, I mean, the reasons why real yields globally are as low as they are is because we have a very large pool of global savings relative to the pool of available investment projects. That's the sort of savings investment imbalance that explains the low level of yields currently, and indeed what has been a secularly falling path for real yields over the better part now of half a century. If you were to ask, what is it then that would cause real yields to begin to pick up? Or put differently, what has been holding back the investment side of the equation over the past few years? Well, that's partly a global story of geopolitical risk, and it's many in various shapes and forms, and most measures of geopolitical risk remain pretty escalated by historical standards. And of course, here in the UK, partly a story of domestic uncertainties, some of them importantly Brexit related, that have provided an extra brake on investment here over the course of the last couple of years. What would enable us to kind of break free? Well, boosting the I side of the equation is the obvious way to go. Governments could be part of that through their public investment, of course. But we've also seen, I think importantly, some of those clouds of uncertainty domestically lift towards the tail end of last year and the early part of this. Certainly, a lot of political uncertainty has dissipated here in the UK over that time horizon, and a goodly chunk, if not all, of the Brexit uncertainty has also lifted. Those ought to be the ingredients that will contribute to investment beginning to pick up. The balance sheet fundamentals, to go back to those, for companies are pretty strong right now. Levels of leverage are low. Leverage of liquidity, those cash piles, are high. The jaws between the cost of capital, which for companies, as for governments, has never in history been lower, and the return on that capital, which probably currently sits in double digits, those jaws are probably as wide as at any time in the past 50 years. As that cloud of uncertainty lifts, you would hope and expect those balance sheet fundamentals to reassert themselves, those jaws begin to bite, and for investment to pick up. It's too early, certainly for me, to be declaring victory on investments, but some early stage signs from surveys suggest there could be a stirring in the undergrowth when it comes to companies' investment plans in this country. Let's hope that bounce in sentiment turns into investment spending.
I'm trying to see where the mics are. Actually, gentleman just there. Yep.
Hello, Sergei Christo, Tory Reform Group. You touched upon poverty. In spring last year, the government quite decisively rejected, I think using quite colourful language as well, a report which was commissioned by the United Nations into UK poverty. One of the things it said that I think about 14 million people, which is fifth of the population, according to a new metric, are living in poverty. That metric included things like housing costs and childcare. Do you think the UK government is in denial?
Well, there's a loaded question.
Yep.
No, I don't think there's any denial about that. I mean, there's, as Chris might point out in a second, actually, I mean, there's many various ways you can measure poverty, you know, whether absolutely or relatively. So I think kind of being careful and cautious about definitions is important. Being careful and cautious about the numbers out there, I think, is important as well. I would take the government's levelling up agenda, which has risen, I would say, to pretty much, if not at the top of its public policy agenda, as being absolutely about those parts of the UK and those households in the UK that are struggling most, that might be on the definition that you mentioned, in poverty of various types. I don't think there's any denial about that. In fact, I think one of the quite reassuring things about the policy debate here in the UK right now is that there isn't really sharp disagreement about the things that aren't going as well as they might, about the structural fault lines or defects in our economy. It's the regional agenda, it's the skills agenda, it's the investment agenda, it's the innovation agenda, it's the infrastructure agenda. I mean, that's not a right versus left or a red versus blue versus green versus yellow debate. There's consensus, there's agreement on the diagnosis. And now we're in the phase of offering some prescriptions about how best to solve those long-standing, deep-rooting defects in our economy, of which the poverty metrics that you mentioned will be one dimension.
Chris?
Chris Giles from the Financial Times. Andy, if a past Andy Haldane had been giving this talk in the 20s or in the 70s, you might again have come up with exactly the same conclusion, that this was a time where we previously had fantastic capitalism and now we're in some trouble. A future Andy Haldane might be doing this in 50 years' time and say, well, look at the 2020s where happiness is at a record level, employment's at a record level. What is it that really is the thing that's concerning you? What is the key measure that means that this time is a time for concern, whereas when we had industrial strife in the 70s, we had mass poverty in the 20s,
Yep.
and those times were actually now you classing them as part of your fantastic era of capitalism.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks, Chris. And every age has its problems, and this one is no exception. And I wouldn't. I was quite careful I hope in the words that I used about the program I set out. This wasn't a ripping up of the model. This was a refresh, perhaps something, a reformation of the model that by and large has served us pretty well. But to try and answer your question directly, what feels different this time? Let me mention three interlocking aspects that I know you and I have discussed over the years, but I want to join them together. One is the evidence of an increasing bifurcation, separation in the fortunes of our companies between those, if you like, that are on the productivity high road and those stuck on the productivity low road. The second is the increasing bifurcation, separation between workers on the skills high road, let's call them 50% that go to university, and those stuck on the low road, the 50% that don't. And the third is the increasing separation, bifurcation, between the fortunes of the regions, the spatial parts of the UK that are steaming ahead. Both their level of income is high and their growth rate is high. And those regions that are being left behind, places where both the level of their performances is low and their growth rate is low. In each of those cases, we are seeing divergence, not convergence. In each of those cases, we are not seeing technological trickle down. We are not seeing heightened social mobility. We are not seeing constrained spatial separation. We're seeing the opposite. And of course, those three dimensions, the tale of two companies, the tale of two workers, the tale of two regions, are very closely interlinked. Indeed, they are three sides of the same coin. Because it tends to be the case that workers on the skills low road tend to work in the companies that are on the productivity low road. And guess what? Those companies tend to be located in the parts of the country, spatially, that aren't doing that well. So if it was to pick one thing that feels different now, that will be a kind of call to arms for action, for a repurposing, refresh, renewal of the model that actually works well but could work better, it will be those interlocking issues of productivity, skills, and place.
And on that note, I'm going to wrap it up. We've got on an extra few minutes, many few minutes, I'm sorry about that. But thank you very much indeed for coming, and our thanks, of course, to Andy Haldane. Thank you very much indeed. There are still drinks available outside if you care to have a mingle.